can take that away as well. We're ready, okay. So welcome everybody to our Q&A on the future of Australia's electricity industry. The CSIRO convened the Future Grid Forum 18 months ago to develop and explore potential scenarios for Australia's energy future and to support the decision-making process around the likely developments between now and 2050. The forum brought together more than 120 representatives from the electricity industry, from government and community to inform and inspire a national conversation about the crucial issues about the future of electricity in Australia. The forum's findings, as most of you will know, are set out in a comprehensive report called Change and Choice, which has been released today, and there's already been a fair bit of media coverage of that on the AM program and many other places. The report models 4 scenarios, and we'll talk in detail about some of those scenarios at the beginning of this discussion. And those scenarios are set along the lines, or they set out to answer 3 important questions. What might Australia's electricity system look like in 2050? What are the issues and the options that will arise along the way? What can the electricity sector and its stakeholders and governments do most effectively to plan and respond to the coming changes, and what Paul Graham here calls mega shifts in the industry? The Future Grid Forum has worked under the principle of open and robust discussion amongst a diversity of stakeholders. Some of them are represented here on the panel, and it intends to encourage others to continue this conversation, make it a national conversation indeed. So this Q&A is a kind of starting point. So naturally there's no Q&A without the Q, the questions, so we're expecting that you here in the audience and those of you who are watching online will be asking us questions. So for those in the audience, the tried and true method of simply putting up your hand will suffice, and we'll get a microphone to you. For those who are watching online, you can go to the special window on the web interface that allows you to submit questions for the panellists. They will appear one by one on the screen in front of me, presumably. Yes, they will. Sorry, we just had a little technical hitch there. It disappeared. It's got a screensaver. One of those terrific technological devices that help people so much. Now I'm going to introduce our panel members, and after that you can applaud them. Dr. Cassandra, I'll just get each of them to indicate who they are for anyone who doesn't know. So Dr. Cassandra Goldie is the CEO of Australian Council of Social Service, the national voice for people experiencing poverty and inequity. Matt McKenzie, sitting next to her, is the Regional Leader, Asia Pacific, GE Digital Energy, which provides integrated smart grid solutions and power delivery to electric utilities, especially looking at solutions for efficient and reliable energy delivery with a stated emphasis on informed and empowered consumers. Anna Skarbek, sitting next to me, is the Executive Director of Climate Works Australia, an independent non-profit organisation committed to catalysing reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in Australia. Very important in this discussion. John Bradley is the Chief Executive of Energy Networks Association, which represents Australia's electricity transmission, distribution and gas distribution sector. Charles Pomple, sitting next to Anna there, is the Executive Advisor Industry Development, SP AusNet. He's here for Grid Australia, which represents the owners of Australia's electricity transmission networks in the National Electricity Market Plus, Western Australia. And Phil Craig is the Executive General Manager, Corporate Affairs at Origin Energy. He's responsible for Origin's brand and reputation, government and media relations, policy development and sustainability. And sitting next to me is Paul Graham, who's the Chief Economist of the CSIRO Energy Flagship. Now, he's also the Future Grid Forum's project leader, and he's got plenty of experience in that capacity, having led 4 other sector-wide initiatives that brought together a diverse group of Australia's leading energy and transport stakeholders. So please welcome our very well-informed panel. Thank you very much. And before we go to questions from the audience, I'm going to bring Paul Graham straight in because the backdrop to the forum's deliberations has been rising prices, the rapid uptake of rooftop solar, the huge expenditure on infrastructure that fed into the prices. All this at a time when there's been an unprecedented decline in demand for electricity. So Paul, can you start by briefly setting out the 4 scenarios that the report has identified for the future of the industry?
Yeah, sure, that's right. So there were 4 scenarios where we really wanted to explore some specific issues. The first one, called Set and Forget, is really exploring this question of what if we really had a concerted effort to limit the growth in peak demand, and if we did that using centralised control, so control of air conditioners, storage systems, industrial peak demand markets. And if we did that in a way where the consumers had to make some initial selections, but then they could just forget about it because it was being controlled centrally. The next scenario, rise of the prosumer, was really exploring a different idea, which is that consumers get really actively involved in their electricity supply. They're generating a lot of their own power, maybe up to 50% of the whole system is generated by consumers. They're controlling their load during the day, making decisions on a daily and seasonal basis, and understanding how that would impact the system. They're also using electric vehicles. The third scenario, leaving the grid, actually starts out with consumers not very engaged at all, and we're not really managing the system very well. And at some point, consumers get, as prices are rising, consumers get offered this opportunity to actually leave the grid altogether. So leaving the grid explores that and tries to understand what the impacts of that might be. And then the fourth scenario, called Renewables Thrive, really starts out thinking about what if we get to 2020 or beyond and we realise that actually reaching a low renewables target was reasonably comfortable with low costs, and maybe storage costs have come down as well. What if we shoot for an ambitious 100% centralised generation from renewables by 2050? And with that, a very high uptake of electric vehicles as well in transport. All of the scenarios, I should say, assume some general level of emission reduction into the future.
Yep, Paul, I've just got to say that all of them also require some substantial changes in technology, and in particular for on-site generation and for people leaving the grid, if that ever happens, it requires power being stored in the home. Now that means battery technology, presumably. So tell us what the future of battery technology is, as you said, because it has to improve a lot for this to happen.
That's right. When we looked at batteries, we think that there's a sort of a growing consensus around at least a 50% reduction, either by around 2020 or 2030, depending on your level of optimism. Also, obviously, we've seen big reductions quickly in solar. Controlled technologies are important in all of these scenarios. So, yeah, technology is a key.
Yeah. As well as that, there is this whole idea. The rise of the prosumer does actually suggest that consumers are going to become vastly more active in the way they manage things. Now, there's an equity issue there, isn't there? I'll hear from the rest of the panel on this, but the sort of people that don't get involved in managing their own electricity supply, people who rent houses and people at the lower end of the market, people who don't have any capital, that's a pretty fundamental part of this whole equation.
Yeah, I think both in leaving the grid and rise of the prosumer, they raise this issue that if you have less volume being pulled off the grid, but the grid's still got to be there for backup, then that could mean that those people left on the grid are sort of left paying for a underutilised asset, whereas those who are using the grid less, generating some of their own power, might be getting the best savings from the system.
So does the report contain, just finally before I go to the rest of the panellists, does the report contain advice for governments on how to deal with this equity issue, how to deal with the people who are having problems paying for electricity and who are also not likely to put in the infrastructure into the buildings they live in?
Well, we've got two options which we put on the table. One is a lot of this can be managed if we manage peak demand, because that's what really causes us to have to build the asset, build the networks. And that's not something we've done particularly well in the past. That's something we're now going to have to look at. And the second thing is we've only just sort of discovered ourselves this, that there probably is this momentum towards on-site generation or off-grid generation. And in some ways we're just raising that now and really looking towards other people to to consider what that might mean for how we regulate the system.
All right, let's hear how the rest of our panel have been considering the report. All of them have seen it, all of them know the recommendations. And I'll start with Anna Skarbek.
Thank you. I'd commend the authors of the report. Those of you who haven't read it yet, it's a very easy read, which you might not always expect for a long report about the electricity grid. And there's a clear message in it that it calls for clarity on the 2050 target and a bipartisan approach to that. And I want to focus on the 2050. And I know at the moment you might think, why? Because the current debate's about 2020. But in the electricity sector, obviously the assets have a long life and 2050 really matters. There's actually, I would think, two things missing from the scenarios when we think about the real implications of that 2050 endpoint. The 2050 goal that's already been agreed by all the nations is this, for climate change, is a 2 degrees stabilisation of global warming, or otherwise known the 450 ppm scenario. That essentially means zero net emissions for all the major economies. And even our most ambitious scenario in this report has 100% renewable energy for electricity, but it's got to go further when you're thinking about, for example, transport, and we would need to see 100% electric transport for at least cars, rather than, say, the 1/3 of cars that's in that ambitious scenario that Paul just talked about. And it might seem far away, but actually the high school children of today will be the cabinet government members in 2050. That's your children who will need to be governing this transition, a zero emissions economy. Now the good news is that that can actually help us avoid some of the problems of underutilisation that you were just discussing that can cause some of the equity challenges, because we will need more electricity demand to allow for all of the vehicle fleet to be electrified. And that's okay if that electricity demand is zero carbon, which we've shown it can be. We can do 100% renewables. So there's a real opportunity for the electricity sector to lead this and to avoid a dip and, if you like, a bust and a boom type approach, which I think is clear. If we're passive, the scenarios show we won't get there, but it gives us a view of what we can plan to achieve and also what we can plan to avoid.
Okay, so this is opening statements from all of our panellists, so we won't actually necessarily debate these issues now. We'll talk about them in the future. Let's hear from Matt, your take on the possibilities engaged here for new technologies, what the scenarios mean to you, and to GE, I suppose.
Yeah, well, to GE, I guess the thing that comes out most particularly for us is that this report predicts a group of scenarios that present incredible mega shifts and big changes, and I guess for a technology company like GE, change is our friend. Our business is founded on innovation, and if you look at our revenue, $150 million of global revenue, $50 million comes from technologies we weren't in the last 10 years. So an opportunity to solve big challenges like this is really at the forefront of what we do, and that's what we're most excited about. I think the other thing that we really like about this particular forum is that it is the industry-wide focus. And this hasn't been done before in Australia. Typically it's been a narrow focus on a particular sector, like generation or the transmission sector or whatever. To have the whole of system approach really is a terrific opportunity.
Yes, you sort of want governments to take notice, wouldn't you? Because that's also at the heart of it. Once the industry gets together and says these things could happen, governments need to take a role.
Sure. I think the thing that an organisation like us looks for at any technology company is that you look for stability and stability in policy. And as we look into the future, we tend to find that the countries that have a stable plan are the ones that we like to invest in the most.
Okay, briefly, the whole issue of technology is crucial. We just heard from Paul, and one of the crucial elements for on-site generation is new generation batteries. Is GE working on those, and how fast do you see the kind of technology one would need for on-site storage in a home developing?
GE does have a battery technology called Girathon. It's a technology that's in its early stages of commercialisation. It has a number of applications, including the renewable sector, but also for, I guess, grid support. And it's something that we're considering. I guess getting to the cost, it's really a scale game, and so it really depends on how quickly these opportunities emerge and how fast it goes. I think the fundamental technology's there. It's really scale that will drive the cost out, and I think that's what the CSIRO reports that are quoted really, is the foundation of those.
Okay, let's stay on this side of the panel for the moment. Cassandra identified the equity issue. What are your thoughts on the 4 scenarios and how they impact on equity?
Yeah, Tony, I mean, obviously we were very pleased that you've picked that issue so early in discussion, and I acknowledge for Paul that what we're doing here is some future planning, and by throwing up the scenarios we get a better sense of what the challenges are and who might be at risk. I mean, for us, we've got 2 key drivers of wanting to be heavily involved in this work. One is, of course, that we really want to see a reduction in emissions, and how we manage our energy is so vital to that. And we want to see that because we know that people on low incomes are hit the first and worst from climate change events. So we're very much in this for that reason. But the tension is, on the other side of it, any one of these scenarios, even those ones that focus more on low emissions, raises this question of the protections for people on really low incomes. Each of them presents challenges there. So we certainly would want to make sure that the protection of people on the lowest incomes, and I think this is also the challenge in our society, where we've got most people actually enjoying living standards better than they've ever enjoyed it, and so we do have some room to move here in using cost-reflective pricing to modify our behaviour. But there's this core group of people, 2.3 million people on our measure living below the poverty line, who are really stuck in their ability to, for example, invest in retrofit, to be protected from the market that will open up with these new technologies. So we certainly would want to see a very specific piece of work continue with whichever scenario, which focuses on particularly the consumer protections, the concession frameworks. I mean, that is a very diverse picture across the politics of this, because energy prices have been highly politicised. So, for example, in Queensland, if you've got a seniors card, you're eligible for the energy rebate, whereas if you're in New South Wales, it's a different picture. So we need a national framework there that the retailers and everybody knows is a stable part of the protections. And finally, energy efficiency. I mean, it's so important for all of us, and yet I think there are some real risks there, particularly because of how many people on low incomes are in rental properties. And that will continue to grow. As a population, more and more of us will be in rental properties, because the other big price challenge is housing costs, folks. And so these go hand in hand together. So we have to get away from this notion that if you want to do something about energy efficiency in rental properties, then it's at the landlord's discretion and the cost flows directly onto the renter.
Okay.
Because that will be a really bad...
Thanks, Sandra. We'll debate some of these issues, hopefully, with the questions in a minute. Let's just hear quickly from our last 3 panellists and we'll go to our first question. John.
So I guess the key issues coming out of this report for us, Tony, are both a story of opportunities and challenges. In terms of the opportunities, the technology trends that are in this report that provide choices for consumers to change how they generate on site or how they use battery storage, they're also the same technology trends which are going to make our network delivery in the future more efficient, because those same kind of technologies are supporting network investment, and networks are going to look at how they use non-network solutions to actually deliver a customer outcome. So there's a lot of opportunity there, but there's 3 big challenges for us as we see the report. The first is to make sure that we've got tariffs that are cost reflective and are sending the right signals to customers about when they're contributing to peak demand, which is the main driver of network costs, which have been so important in recent price increases. The other key challenge is to make sure that we've got a stable investment environment. In all 4 scenarios, the amount of network infrastructure that needs to be invested is about the same, and it's over $300 billion over the period between now and 2050. Now, that investment needs to occur in a way that provides least cost outcomes to consumers, and that means we need to have a regulatory environment which is low risk and allows capital to be sourced in an efficient way. The The third issue, Tony, is probably that we've got to make sure.
Now, I'm just being asked to get everyone to speak directly into those microphones because people online are having a little trouble hearing.
Sorry. The third issue, Tony, is that we've got to make sure we've got a policy environment which encourages consumers to make sensible choices and the right choices that are going to deliver benefits to them. So the rise of the prosumer scenario, scenario 2, actually has customer bill outcomes which are about 30% higher than the other three scenarios. It's the real standout, and it happens because there's an irrational overinvestment in on-site generation. Now, on-site generation will provide a lot of benefits, but we need to make sure we've got good policy settings and consumers are informed when they make their choices.
Yeah, okay, well, more to talk about there, obviously. Let's hear from Phil, because if people leave the grid, where does that leave Origin and other companies like yours?
Thank you, Tony. That's a nice way to start. Look, we obviously we appreciate this report and this whole process because the comment about starting an energy...
I might just get you to, the people online need to hear this as well, and so just be aware with the microphones. Go ahead. So,
I mean, starting an energy conversation is a really important thing to do. Undoubtedly across all industries over a 37, 40-year time horizon there's going to be a lot of change, and there's lots of questions asked in this report about what that change might look like for energy. Energy is currently delivered in the same sort of way that it has been for basically a century. Centralised generation and a big distribution grid. Now we know that will change. The important thing is how consumers interact with the industry through that change process, and the question of how you balance, as Cassandra pointed out, the costs of investment in different technologies with the need for continuing reliability and the need to draw down emissions. And what these scenarios do is set out different ways that we could get to that outcome. The important thing is what customers actually want. And as a retailer and a generator, we're obviously interested in being involved in the technology process, in the innovation process, staying close to our customers and being relevant. So when you say if people start to leave the grid or generate their own electricity, what does that mean for us? Disconnect. I mean, there's a long way to go before people can disconnect. They need to be able to generate enough electricity for their own use, but also they need to have storage capacity, and they need to be prepared for that lack of reliability, that ability to call on the grid when they need it. So our role is to stay close to customers, to be involved in that process, and in 2050 we want to be very well connected to customers and providing whatever the solutions are. And I think, as Matt said, the beauty of this is its risk and opportunity. And from an Origin perspective, we see it more as opportunity.
Okay, Charles.
Thanks, Tony. Look, from a transmission perspective, I think the challenges have already been outlined. It's reducing network utilisation is a challenge, but I think to put that in context, the biggest challenge for transmission is the uncertainty. Transmission's big and lumpy. You have to invest in it in large lumps, and it's there for a long time. So particularly in an uncertain environment, you've got to get that planning right. And I think that's why this report's a really valuable addition, that it forces us to think about different futures and in fact planning for the future, look at alternatives now. Because even if these things don't happen for 50 years or 30 years, some of those time frames are quite long, and we need to be planning for that now. Transmission has sat in the centre of the market, and it's facilitated the market as well, and that's the way transmission has developed over many years. In fact, it's been said, of course, that the power system is the most complex machine on earth. And I think these changes, and we need to embrace these changes, make that even more complex. And that still raises the need for integration, and I think that's the real opportunity, at a technical level at least in the future, is integrating all these different additions to the network to make sure they work well together, because I think the benefits you can get from a system working well together exceed the benefits that you get from the component parts coming together. So that's an opportunity, I think, for the future as well. As being a network business, we need to change, and I think our role will change in the future, both at the distribution and transmission level. We need to be much more engaged in a dynamic industry, which this will be, and to be dynamic players in that industry. And I think the roles of networks will change to provide different services and different benefits.
Okay, let's go to questions from the floor. Put your hand up if you've got a question. We'll get a microphone to you quickly. Have we got any questions out there? If not, I have a few. Yep, go ahead.
You've all mentioned some very interesting points with regards to the challenges that each of your stakeholder groups represent. One of the most common things that I heard was a lack of standardization of incentives and signals that are being sent to the different stakeholders. How much of a barrier is a non-privatized distribution and transmission network in achieving any of these scenarios that we're talking about?
Yeah, let's start with Paul on that.
We didn't really think about whether distribution or transmission was privatised or not as being a big issue. I think you have to think about what's the starting point right now. The starting point is you've got, apart from Victoria, most people don't have a very intelligent metering or control system in their house. They're getting a volume-based contract and very low awareness about what appliances in their house contribute to their load at different times of day. So it's just the starting point in terms of consumer knowledge, in terms of equipment, in terms of the tariff structure, which I saw as the main barriers anyway.
Charles, I'd like to hear you on that. And Victorian system is actually considerably ahead of others in terms of the smart grid, which is necessary nationally for a lot of these things to happen.
Yeah, I think the Victorian government took some initiative and mandated a smart meter rollout, which has had its own challenges and own learnings for the future, but it does put Victoria in a position to be able to grow from that platform and to deliver benefits to customers through the smart grid. I don't think ownership's an issue. I think it's really a matter of, I think standards is. I think standards that was raised in that question is important, that if we can achieve a levelised playing field and a common standard, if you like, to develop smarter techniques for networks and for customers, then that's a key, but I don't think ownership's a key for that.
And let's hear from John on that as well.
Tony, I think I'd agree with the others that ownership isn't really the issue. We've got a mix of members, private and public, across the Networks Association, and we see the challenges that are coming through technology and the need to...
I might need to get that microphone to you again there, mate, sorry.
We see the primary challenges in terms of the demand outlook and technology changes as being universal. There's differences in different jurisdictions, but what we really need is the enabling technology in terms of advanced metering and tariff reform.
But if the way things are going, if some of these predictions of mega shifts are right, there's going to be a tremendous number of extra players on the scene. Competition will thrive, presumably. Let's hear from Origin Energy on that.
Well, and we welcome competition, as we always do.
Yeah.
Maybe if I can take that concept of competition and what might evolve and maybe link it back to that question is, one of the things we found in Victoria with that rollout of that smart metering technology is, as a retailer, it provides a very large platform with about 3 million households for us to think about what the new products might be. And it also enables new entrants to look at a large base and think, well, what kind of innovation can we bring to that smart grid? If we don't get that same kind of rollout in other states, then it'll be more piecemeal and it's a little harder to think about.
It's sort of the base, isn't it, for creating energy efficiency, which is that most households need to have this kind of technology, otherwise the real energy efficiency benefits don't happen.
Oh, and first and foremost, what smart grid and smart meters do is enable us to provide technology that customers can see their consumption. At the moment, all customers see is a 3-monthly bill with very little detail on it. To be able to talk to customers about how they can change consumption and be more efficient or think about other solutions is very hard when you don't have visibility. With smart meter technology, you can show them in half-hour increments and how that can change. And then that can lead into innovation around tariff structures, cost for peak energy versus off-peak, control mechanisms, etc. So you really do need that underlying platform technology.
So are you disappointed there hasn't been a national approach to this? It's a national issue. I mean, why should these issues stop at state borders? We learnt that mistake many years ago when we built railway lines with different gauges.
Yes, that's true. Look, there have been some efforts to try and have a national standard around at least what kind of meters go in and what kind of communications capability. I think there have been some lessons with the Victorian rollout and perhaps that scared off some of the other jurisdictions. But if we can get some sort of a standard mechanism in place, at least as we piecemeal roll out smart meters, then you can start to build the broader network.
Let's hear from our audience again. Any questions? Yes, we've got one up the back. We'll get a microphone to you.
Good morning. My name's Nigel Maitland. I'm from AMS Technologies International. My question about these 4 scenarios is they are all predicated about doing something. One of the questions that isn't being explained clearly to consumers is why do we need to change? What would happen if we just keep... The network's been running, has been accurately pointed out, for the best part of the last 100 years. It's working pretty well. Can the panel please explain to people who aren't industry insiders what will happen if we don't change, if we don't modify, if we leave our behaviour the way it is?
It's a very good question, and I'll start with Paul on this, since you've basically led the team. And can I just add this to it? I mean, we've seen 66% rise in domestic electricity costs in 6 years. But your report projects only a much smaller price rise over the next 20 years, 2 to 9%, I think it is, or something along those lines. That actually makes a case for doing nothing, and a lot of people will say it does.
Yeah, so there actually are some reasonable price increases. I think the point we make is more that they'll still be manageable within the context of rising incomes. But I guess what the starting point, as we said, was at the moment the main signal that our small commercial and residential customers get is that to reduce your electricity bill, you should basically reduce your volume of use. But that hasn't really worked in terms of keeping network costs down in Australia. Hasn't really worked in terms of getting the right signals to people, because what we've done in the last 5 years is we've doubled our ownership of air conditioners, and we've, together with increasing reliability standards and other factors, that's really driven the increase in network costs, and that will just roll on. We'll find more ways of using more power expensive devices in the future, and our network costs and other costs will just keep increasing in a fairly inefficient way. We'll have an inefficient use of our networks, and so really some of these scenarios are really looking at how might we break that cycle. And the first scenario, set and forget, was really about is there ways we can control peak demand a bit better? Because we did the counterfactual on that and said, well, if we don't do that, if we just let peak demand grow in the way it has in the past, people can expect to pay about 2 cents per kilowatt hour extra on their electricity bill. So there is a saving here to be had. Putting that in other terms, it's about 1.4 billion saving. That is an opportunity if we want to be smarter about how we use energy.
Let's hear from Matt on the do-nothing scenario. It will be a temptation for people to do nothing unless they see the potential for large price increases coming down the track. That's one side of an economic argument. The broader argument is about long-term sustainability, etc.
Yeah, I think the do-nothing scenario, we talk about the leaving the grid, is in fact a big part of the do-nothing scenario, particularly around peak management. So that's a situation where, when you look across all of the scenarios, I think every single one of them says that we really do have to step up to peak demand management. So as a technology company, that's something...
Well, just get that microphone closer to you, sorry.
Yeah, so every scenario, really, for every single one of them, there is a case for doing more around peak demand management, and particularly around, if we just let things flow and we continue to have volume-based pricing, we're going to get to a point, one of the scenarios shows, where people will leave the grid. So from a technology provider's point of view, I think what it says to us is that peak demand management technology is important, and that's something that we're focused on. We're presently piloting our Power-On precision demand response management system. It's effectively smart grid technology. It has deployments in the US, but we're piloting it right now in one of the Victorian distribution organisations, which would allow for both situations where you could have customers engage more. The pro-consumer provides the underlying technology for them to have the choice, but it also importantly provides the technology for a set and forget, where we manage peaks for everybody, including renters, as Cassandra points out. We've got to look at the whole community.
Okay, Cassandra.
I mean, I think it would be very, very dangerous for particularly vulnerable people for us to do nothing. I mean, right now, I think every year we have at least 60,000 or more disconnections on a really essential piece of supply. If you watch the Four Corners program, I will never forget, again, that story of a young child who was scared every night because she wasn't allowed to have the light on because they couldn't afford to pay their power bills. And that situation is not an isolated, extreme example. So I think on the pure sort of cost implications for those households, we have to address the way in which the current environment is impacting on the really low-income people. The other part of it is we are already in a market environment. There's a growing awareness about the ways in which you can reduce your energy consumption, and people who have the flexibility and the capability will do that. So that will have an impact on demand. It will also leave a lot of other people behind who just don't have the ability to do any of that kind of behavioural change.
We know, Cassandra, that in fact it's already happened on the radio this morning. The big question has been what will happen to my electricity bill in the future? What will happen to my electricity bill? Is there an answer in this report?
Obviously, there is an expression here of the way in which you use price to drive behaviour. And as I say, we're not opposed to that notion because it absolutely makes sense, but also it creates a real vulnerability for people, that if we use price in that way, even with smart meter, knowledge about the pressures of when you're using your energy, unless people are fully informed and confident about what they do, they will simply turn off. And I am very, very concerned about people who are not plugged in, who will just turn their power off because they are frightened about what their bill will be like. And so we also need, I'm concerned that we're going to see a pullback from targeted programs for people on really low incomes with this sort of confidence of a sort of a growing national framework, when in fact on any of these scenarios we will be needing to make sure there's a very active piece of work done to make sure that people who are the most vulnerable have a continuous, reliable supply. The mix of state privatisation is, the challenge on that is that it's become so much more complex about how you do that. And so that's what we're grappling with. It's almost like, we have spent a lot of time with Origin, as you know, but we can't spend time with every company. We've got to actually find a way to get those kinds of national standards and protections in place that don't undermine the efficiencies of a market environment.
Before I come to the other side of the panel on the do nothing thing, I just want to hear quickly from Paul on the what happens to my electricity bill question. What does the report predict?
So we say, in rough terms, the current electricity bill is about $1,800 for the average user. Across the scenarios, the bills go up into the sort of $2,000 to $2,500, and but your income goes up to compensate for that. So it's about 2.5% of your electricity bills, about 2.5% of wages today. It'll be about that same amount in 2050. So we'll be able to cope with the increase, but some increases are there. They have to be there because we're reducing emissions, and we know, as far as we know right now, you have to use more expensive technologies to do that. And the second thing is, even though we're doing a lot in these scenarios to manage peak demand and keep the network utilisation as high as possible, it does get lower in some of these scenarios, so we can't avoid some increase in the network cost as well.
Okay, Charles, the do nothing principle.
Yeah, I'll be quick. Tony, I think there's no such thing as a do nothing really, because we're in an environment now of unprecedented change, and change will happen. So from my point of view, a lot of the, for the example addition of solar PVs, that's happening on our network. So there's no option to do nothing. We've got to change with that and promote that and respond in the way that lowers prices and improves services to
Anna.
There's another important reason why change is essential, in addition to the asset efficiency and system-wide efficiency that we need to maintain, because technology is going faster than the regulation and the structure of the monopoly nature of the system. And that change, the reason is climate change. that the nations, all of the nations of the world have already agreed that 2 degrees is the level of dangerous climate change that we should seek to stabilise at and avoid anything more. And in all of these scenarios, we're on a path for 3 degrees at least. So actually the change will happen to us whether we're prepared for it or not. And what these scenarios in fact don't include, because it's discussed in the report but it's acknowledged it's too early to do, is the costs of a 3 degrees world. In each of these scenarios, we actually don't achieve the emissions reductions that the nation's leaders have declared we must achieve by 2050. So if that's the case, we're in a 3 degrees climate change world which carries costs, and those costs of peak demand days, of coastal inundation to assets and infrastructure, those costs are described in the report, and there's an estimate of their impact, and it's more than the impact of not managing peak demand, for example, on bills. But it hasn't been factored into the costs of the system because that's very hard to do. The report acknowledges we're not ready to do it yet. So actually, the costs of doing nothing, even in these scenarios, are understated because of that imposed cost which the planet will impose on us. So I think the governments are yet to work out the mechanism for getting there, but they've already agreed the goal, which is the 2 degree stabilisation, and we have to prepare for it.
I'm going to quickly go to Paul to respond to that. It's a suggestion that climate change or the impact of it is not really built into these scenarios. The report does note the energy sector is especially vulnerable to changes in climate, though.
That's right. I mean, the climate affects the day-to-day operation in every way. It's very important. The one thing we were able to look at was what if we get more heat wave events and so forth, and that might lead to a higher probability of peaks in the future. If we had to build a more robust network for that, it costs an extra, I think, 2.8 cents per kilowatt hour on your electricity bill. And that just gave us a sense of the benefit, if you like, of avoiding those climate impacts if they can be avoided.
Okay, and I think it's time to hear from Origin as well on this whole question of what should actually happen to mitigate against the issues of climate change. Origin actually has a big effort here, obviously, but I'm wondering if any of this can work without a concrete price signal.
Well, there's a big question again, Tony.
It's an important one, though, wouldn't you agree?
It is an important one. And look, I guess this comes back to, and I think the question was a very good question, because we have a lot of investment in our current system, and we have a very deep generation portfolio with excess capacity in the system and a very sophisticated network grid. So why do we need to do anything? And it does come back to the fact that it's not us actively doing something, it's the external trends that impact us. And clearly there is a community desire to move to a progressively lesser emissions portfolio in Australia. Now that involves moving to gas-fired generation, it involves introducing renewables into the system, distributed generation can help, etc. But the trick with that is getting that balance right, as we talked about before, about the cost, the investment that's already in there, the reliability. Our generation portfolio is very reliable, renewables are more intermittent. So there are a lot of complex questions in this. Yes, we need to think about what are the best drivers to achieve the balance there, and policy can help. But markets generally find the solution, and customers take things up when they're economically viable. We're a big investor in renewables. We're also a leader in terms of providing solutions to customers if they want green power, if they want solar panels. What we found is that take-up rate has been relatively slow because the price is not right at the moment. As those costs change, you'll find people will move more to renewables and to distributed generation and to smart products. And so our role in that is to be conscious of the trends, to be conscious of what's coming, and to move with customers on that journey.
How big, I mean, we're not seeing any or significant investment at the moment in power generation. The big shift that was meant to happen to gas-fired power generation, which you just talked about, which was described as being fundamental to this thing, is not happening. So what would have to happen to make it happen?
Well, I guess the reason for that at the moment is we're not seeing much change at all in the generation portfolio, because you mentioned something right at the beginning. We've had this drop-off in demand, and there's a few different reasons for that. As you know, manufacturing industry is struggling at the moment in Australia for a variety of reasons, but we've also seen energy efficiency. We've seen the impact of solar going in. Solar's on about 8 or 9% of roofs nowadays. So we've seen some changes which have meant we've got excess capacity in the system. So we're not seeing any need for new capacity. There's a little bit of wind build and there's a continuing rollout of solar, but not much is changing in the system. Now, in order to do that, you would need to have a very significant carbon price at the moment, because the gap in price between our generation portfolio and renewables is so significant. So either there's a very strong subsidisation of that, or at the moment we have no need to bring that generation in.
John, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think...
Sorry, we'll need to get the microphone to you again.
Thank you. Look, I think probably the question about why do we need to change, we need to change because, as we were saying earlier, the external forces are moving, but also because we've got to make sure we've got a more resilient system when we have these forces affecting our future electricity supply system. So if we don't have our tariffs right in terms of the tariff settings and move away from highly volumetric charges, then we will get a unfairness in terms of cross-subsidies being provided from some customers to others, and that's a key issue in terms of the equity argument, as well as sending a signal about getting the peak demand effects that we were talking about earlier. So there's some real reasons why it's in our interests to change. What the 4 scenarios show, though, is a question about how engaged customers want to be themselves in that change process. So set and forget isn't doing nothing. It's actually the centralised system trying to address these issues centrally. But if you look at a scenario like leaving the grid, in that scenario, you've got customers that are engaged. In the rise of the prosumer, you've got customers very engaged. But there are very different costs between those scenarios. In the leaving the grid scenario, you actually have the highest amount of total expenditure of over $1 trillion between now and 2050, and that's about 20% higher than the set and forget scenario. So that's a lot of cost that has to be recovered from end users at the end of the day, and that's the benefit of this scenario work, is looking at what kind of choice and engagement we want to have in that long-term planning.
Okay, let's go back to questions. I think we did have we've got a few hands up here. We've got one at the back. We'll go to that first, and then we'll come down to this gentleman on the right-hand side. Go ahead.
Thanks, Tony. The question I've got is, in our increasingly digitalised world, what role did intelligence on the networks play in the report? You know, we're not just going to see electricity running across the grid, but we're going to see data as well, managing all the devices from consumer right through. So how important was that in your scenario planning?
Yeah, let's go to Paul on that. We have sort of addressed this a little bit with the smart grid issue, but go ahead.
Yeah, there's a lot of things here that really can't be done without some sort of new smart interfaces or communication systems that we haven't really envisaged yet. I mean, and we try to put a little of this into our scenario graphics, but you know, maybe you're getting information coming to your iPhone. Maybe it's we're not really sure yet. I think if Telstra were here, I think they're actually quite excited about some of the opportunities that some of these scenarios explore. About, you know, what sort of engagement could you have?
Matt?
Yeah, I think it's on 2 levels. You know, we talked about...
Get the microphone close to you, sorry.
Yeah, on 2 levels. We've already talked about the role of technology in peak management, but there are so many areas of driving productivity in smart grid. You know, we talk about big data analytics and using data captured from the network, both real time and over a period of time, helps us drive more efficient planning decisions and more efficient ways to operate the grid, and ultimately, you know, optimise the capital investment, optimise the safety. A huge role to play.
And Cassandra, this obviously raises the question of the digital divide, and I suppose to add to that, are state governments getting actively involved in putting these kind of technologies into public housing at least? We know rental housing is a problem. What about public housing?
We do have sort of a patchwork across the country of efforts to target energy efficiency, you know, refitting, including in public housing, but it's nowhere near at the scale that we need. And so, and I think, watch this space as we continue to look for savings. I am concerned that we might see the programs that are working, even though they're small, being on the chopping block because of the lack of a big voice about how vital this is. I think...
So we're talking here about short-term savings versus long-term savings, aren't we, in economics?
Exactly. And, you know, I think at one level, because the dominant discussion is very much from the experience of Middle Australia, the focus on the people who are the most vulnerable is just hard. It's really hard to keep that front and centre. And bearing in mind, of course, that not all the solutions for low-income households are to be found within the energy markets debate. We've got a big challenge because of how low some of our social security arrangements have become over time. And I know that some of our friends in corporate Australia have started to get behind our efforts to get an increase in the unemployment payment and some of these other measures that actually impact on affordability of energy. So I think we've also, one of our biggest challenge in a number of areas, including energy but also telecommunications, is on the one hand, you know, an overwhelming recognition from many voices that the market has a big place in this, but on the other hand, that how do we do that in a way that ensures that we don't de-link market arrangements from social policy and economic policy. In other words, the social security net. At the moment, there's no mechanism at any level to actually bring those pieces of work together. And
it's actually one of the key recommendations of the report at the end. The social security net, the safety net, will have to be looked at very closely.
That's right. I'm hoping I think there was a recommendation to increase the unemployment payment, but jokes aside, I mean, the market is carrying the cost of a lot of this at the moment. I mean, I know that there are concerns within big corporations about the effort that they go to dealing with people who are under real financial pressure. I think there is a growing culture, of course, around concern for disconnections. There are standards about that, expectations on the market about responding to that, and we need to provide a place in this future planning to not just talk about it, Tony. It is actually about getting it into the mechanisms of decision making, and I think the energy law area is a problem at the moment on doing
Let's
that.
quickly hear from Phil on that issue, and the question was actually about digital technology, the role it may play, and you can address that, but the other side of the equation is the lack of digital technology in certain sectors, and this inequity issue once again.
Yeah. Look, we're fully expecting to provide our solutions using smart meter technology to customers on iPhone, on iPad, etc. So
I'll get you to just speak into that mic again, sorry.
We expect our solutions to be usable on all sort of mobile devices, and for those solutions to go beyond just education of customers about what they use, but starting to look at automated technology in the future as time progresses. I think the question on affordability and the less fortunate parts of the community, Cassandra raises some good points. We deal with that every day, and there are some people who can't pay their electricity bill. And it's not just the electricity bill though, and it's not just a question for us. It is a broader question. It's their entire cost of living, their household budget. So thinking about how whatever one of these scenarios we end up seeing, or whatever the mix is, making sure that that's a solution for all Australians, not the some who can afford solar panels up front, etc., is a really important consideration. Okay,
I'm going to try to get to as many questions as possible, so we'll go to that question and I'll distribute among the panellists who answers.
Thank you, Tony. Paul Butter from Smart Grid Australia. My question is, this is a highly regulated and, may I say, politicised sort of environment that we operate in, so government leadership, in my opinion, is critical, yeah? And several people, of course, have mentioned that, but what we've seen is quite often piecemeal sort of silo-based sort of solutions, a little bit on solar, a little bit here, a little bit there. There's not a holistic approach. So my question is, what's the message from the panel and from the report in relation to the government, in relation to, you know, how do we address that in a more sophisticated way?
Let's start with Charles.
I think there is a recommendation in the report that points to that, and I think it's the last one actually, around the need to look at market frameworks and the whole infrastructure that we have supporting the development of the market and the market at the detailed level. So I think that is a pointer to the future, that we do need some leadership or some collective thinking anyway. It comes back to this question of integration, and I think that is key, not only at the technical but also at the commercial and market level.
Anna.
Could I add also that there's a message, I think you're right, government leadership is obviously key. I think a key message from this report is that it's time to look at the electricity system as a whole. And you were right to identify previous attempts at piecemeal. And that's because it's obviously easier to control smaller parts if you're one part of that. So I think that's a key contribution. Step one is that let's help learn the lessons of looking at the system as a whole. There's also a message to industry in this report, and that is that government leadership is easier when the community asks for it. That when industry helps the government show what path of leadership might be best to follow. So I think what this report is asking for is the conversation to become louder and more holistic and industry-led so that you can seize the opportunity that's here. And I wanted to use that point to add to the previous question on data. The question wasn't just about the digital technology, but about the value of the data that will flow through the network, not just the electrons flowing through the network. And it's a great point because information is power and we manage what we measure. We're seeing already industry is taking some of the lead here. In the large industry sector where they are measuring their data, there's been a program for 4 or 5 years to ask large companies to report on their energy use. ClimateWorks research has found that the companies that admitted that they regularly analyse the data rather than just collect the data, they are achieving more than triple the level of energy savings than the average in that large industry sector.
And John, I'll go to you on the same question. How important is it that there be a kind of unified approach and that this national conversation is paid attention to at a national level?
Yeah, it's clearly critical. The good news is that there is a base here already that we can work through. What we have with the Energy Ministers Forum called SCUR is...
Once again, I might get you to...
Yep.
Sorry about that.
I'm sorry about that.
I'm just thinking about our online viewers here.
No, thank you. What we have with the Energy Ministers operating a SCUR is a fairly detailed program. So there's been no lack of review and no lack of analysis of the energy sector in the last 2 years. In fact, it's probably been one of the periods of greatest regulatory review in the last 2 years. And there is a detailed SCUR framework that deals with the key issues we're talking about in this report, including metering reform, including pricing and network pricing reform, including the deregulation of retail pricing to open up better innovation in retail services to customers. What we need to do is take the takeaways from this report and make sure we've kept as much flexibility in our regulatory system so we can allow customers to make choices, but also businesses to evolve. So network businesses will need to be providing very different businesses in the future to very different services in the future to the way they operate now, and it'll be an extended service which looks towards supporting the customer with on-site generation and other kinds of technology.
In terms of the profile of the argument, the discussion and the debate, we live in a federation. Should it be one of the key issues dealt with at COAG, for example?
And so COAG has discussed it in the past, and it was discussed about 12 months ago at a COAG meeting, and there's a COAG agenda around this framework. Clearly, what's happening here is that the technology, the consumer preferences, the surprising fall away in demand is moving faster than our regulatory process and frankly faster than our business models at the moment. And so what's happening is you've got a sector and a regulatory framework that's trying to adjust.
Yeah, Phil, can I just bring you in on that issue? Because and there's a reference there to business models. I mean, your business model could be under threat under some of these scenarios.
Oh, absolutely. Over time, under each of the scenarios, there are challenges for Origin. Interestingly, the retailers face the same sort of impacts if you look through the reports as consumers. So our futures are very much entwined. I'm hopeful in terms of the policy environment. I mean, SCUR is connected into COAG, and the response to the question, we have a lot going on in the energy space at the moment, not just the consideration of what happens to the carbon price, but renewable energy target. We have a target in place, consideration of how that needs to be restructured. I'm quite hopeful that elements of the direct action policy that's being proposed, etc., will be able to encourage some of the things we've talked about today. So I think, and there's a new energy white paper coming that will try and wrap all of this up into a long-term policy. So I think if industry is constructive in that process with government, we can influence a more holistic policy.
Do you worry that the renewable energy target might come under threat? New government, new priorities?
Well, I think the renewable energy target needs to be considered in the same context as what we're talking about today and what I mentioned earlier, the balance of what you're trying to target, the costs and the reliability questions, and the changes that we've seen with drops in demand and challenges around the rollout of solar. I think that policy has been a progressive policy that we need to have another look at and rethink.
Are you saying too progressive?
No, well, maybe and maybe not. I mean, it gets to a 2020 target, but what we're talking about here is 2050 futures. So it's not just the short term we need to get that balance right, but it's the longer term. So what's the policy about, and how do you get that balance, and is it actually achieving what we want?
I'll just bring Anna in on that question because it will come up for discussion in the quieter sections of cabinet meetings and so on. What do you think is likely to happen, and what must happen from your point of view?
Look, I think the last thing that Phil mentioned is the best thing to focus on, to move the focus from 2020 to 2050. Your answers get very different when you do that. And at the moment, there's a concern in the electricity sector that the reason the renewable energy target feels under threat is because it's forcing new supply into a market where demand is falling, and that has costs for the existing suppliers. So naturally, the vested interests begin to comment on that. But if you extend the focus out to 2050, you realise that we need to do all of that and more. But if we plan it over the generation and people know what's coming after that, then they might feel less afraid about what the immediate impact is because they can plan to a longer horizon.
Let's see if there are any more questions out there. I'm sure there were. There's one right down the front here. Get a microphone to you, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you. Joachim Glick from Smart Grid Australia. The report recommends a lot of changes from multiple entities, technologies, utilities, policymakers and regulators. And each and every one of those will have implications to the end consumers. Indeed, each and one of those will require action from end consumers. The history of this industry is that there's been a vast disconnect between end consumers and changes in the industry. How do you see this this gap being bridged in the future? And perhaps just to add one more specific question targeted to you, Tony, not as the moderator, but as the only representative of the media industry here, how do we get the key messages out of this report to the vast population?
Yes, because the media doesn't deal very well with complexity, and that is a huge issue. Yeah, I mean, already this morning, you will have seen that commercial radio has taken up only one part of this argument. That is, what does the report tell us about, I think we mentioned this earlier, about how household electricity prices will be affected in coming years. That's it. So the broader argument, which is complex, is very rarely dealt with properly in the media, and particularly not the popular media. So I don't quite know the answer to that, to be honest with you. I know the ABC will try our very best to deal with the complexities, but it is a serious problem that we have short-term thinking not only in the media but in politics, and both feed into each other. Now, I think that is a really fundamental intellectual problem, almost an existential problem for the country. So how we deal with that in the future, it's up to good people in the media to try and change that. I'll do my best, and we'll see what happens beyond that. Let's go to the other question, and Paul, go to you. This question about well, you call them prosumers. We should actually describe what a prosumer is. I don't think we did that right at the beginning.
Yeah, a prosumer is really a consumer who's actively involved in shaping the product that they receive. And in this case, it's really the consumer asking for and wanting these new ways of managing their electricity and using electricity. I mean, on the question of how does the consumer deliver themselves into these scenarios and become aware of all these issues? We did do some social research on this question throughout the project, and certainly we know that the more information people get, the more they're able to grapple with the topics, and there's also issues of trust. So in some ways, the industry will need to bring government and community groups and everyone along at the same time so that they hear messages from more than just the industry. Beyond that, I suspect my colleagues probably have...
Yeah, I would, but before we go to that, is it a failure of the industry that people who are consuming, for the most part, are not aware of even how to use the peak demand to their advantage when they're organising their power use?
You know, I think consumers were quite comfortable not having to think about these things until electricity prices got quite high.
Yes.
And, you know, I put myself in that category. But there's too many things now happening and changing in the industry where there now needs to be, and this is what the report recommends, probably a concerted awareness campaign that will take quite a few years for everyone to get up to speed with the things we need to address to limit those increases and to open up the opportunities for people to manage their energy in different ways.
Let's hear from Cassandra, and you can address the media question too if you wish.
Sure. Just on the point about the communication with the consumer and the culture that you're dealing with in the household, I'm less sceptical about the lack of desire of people to address their energy use and it not just being about price. I think what we saw in previous elections was this real groundswell from people of concern around climate, recognition that carbon pollution was a problem, and really wanting to know not only what government could do, but actually what can I do? And I don't think we've had a really effective communication strategy which actually explains to people, bang for your buck, these are the three things that if you can manage to do it, will help us as a nation. And I think that's a really missing piece of all of this, to bring everybody with us on some of the more complex discussions about the future. I think this point about the media is really well made. I think it does highlight for me one of the big flaws we've got in public policy development at the moment, which is that we seem to have lost the capacity to bring together business, community and environment people on a regular basis to look at the big picture and to come out with some pretty consistent views about what we all think needs to be done. So I like to say to the politicians, we're here to help, because it can't all be done just by government leadership either. Otherwise you get into this very sort of political cycle which is all about response, voices out there without kind of groups around carrying the message through. The challenge, in my experience, I've got to say, Tony, is that the consensus is not such good news for the media. They like to see us fighting amongst ourselves. And actually, every time I got into one of these meetings, which we create to bring us all together, we've always got more in common than the issues that divide us. And so this is a message certainly to the new government at the federal level about trying to get that mechanism in place at the highest level. I was disappointed that we've only got a business advisory group for the Prime Minister when really we should have that tripartite group around the PM for all the big questions, because you can't separate out energy, which is a big issue for the country, from a number of other areas of expertise that would help us to inform where we drive some of these big questions for the country.
Yeah, Matt, you can put on your consumer hat or your business hat, whichever you prefer to answer that question.
I think there's firstly there's no silver bullet.
And we'll get the microphone in close.
I think there's no silver bullet. We all have to do a lot, every part of the industry, in terms of engaging consumers more, energy users more, and the report states that. You know, one thing I'd share from a technology provider's point of view that we can do is allow people to understand the technology in a way that they can digest. For example, if you go to the G Energy website, our Grid Explorer website, we've developed a whole range of computer animated graphical videos that explain technology in simple terms that people can understand, and I think we can use that sort of an approach in a much broader way. You also see it on, if you go onto the retailers and the distributors' websites, you'll see that they've come a long way in recent times, and there's no doubt that the rise in price that Paul mentioned has certainly triggered us all to engage energy users in a much greater sense.
Yeah, let's hear from Phil on that. That is the huge issue, isn't it? I mean, people start to get much... I mean, for generations, let's face it, people did not care, because you could turn on as many lights in your house. Your electricity bill wasn't going to be the huge driver in your household. Now it's one of the really big drivers, alongside mortgages and credit card debt, etc.
That's absolutely right. The profile of this industry was very low 5 to 10 years ago, and has been the price increases that have driven that increase. Our research with consumers tells us a couple of things. One is they really don't know very much about this industry, even to the extent of what is my energy measured in and what drives it. And two is that superficially at least they don't really want to engage. But when you have deeper conversations with them, they do start to become interested in, well, now I start to understand what renewable energy means. Now I start to understand what the trade-offs are, what drives my energy consumption, what I might be able to do about it. But having that conversation in this industry is difficult. It's a pretty impenetrable sort of industry. But we have started on that path, as Matt points out, all of us, and we have made good progress.
Would it help, by the way, to have a national advertising campaign? I mean, we do that on other public benefit issues. It would be quite good for an advertising company to get a hold of this message and sort of distill it in some way, like the Slip, Slop, Slap campaign and many others that government's been involved in. Is there a role for government there, or should you be doing it as private enterprise?
Oh, look, I think we do it to the extent that we can, but we're talking about an industry, and I can't remember who pointed it out before, but we've got different rules in different states and different setups and different tariffs. So distilling it down to a simple message is actually very hard, even for a national retailer, let alone a government.
There could be the message I would be thinking about would be how you can lower your electricity prices by doing X, Y, or Z. That would be a message that people who are worried about electricity prices would probably absorb.
And look, and I think there is work going on in trying to get those messages out. I think within industry and I think within government, everyone started to realise that people don't know what to do. And that's one of the reasons why there's so much angst around the industry is people can see their prices have gone up and they see these big bills, but they're not actually sure what to do about it. So before we even talk about some of the things in these scenarios coming true, we actually have to help people understand.
Yep, okay. Let's, we've got time for one more question. We've got a question in the middle there. We'll get the microphone to you.
Hi, my name is Olivia. I'm from the Climate Institute, so my preoccupation is probably going to be a bit obvious. One of the 4 key asks from the report is for that the stakeholders of the group have agreed on is the call for bipartisan support for a long-term emissions reduction mechanism and pathway to get there, and long-term meaning 2050. Obviously, that's a tough ask in the current environment, so I'm keen to find out from industry how they plan to push that message out in terms of their engagement with government, in terms of their engagement with customers, and also, you know, how far they're looking ahead and how far they working back from where Anna says we need to be in 2050.
Okay, important
Recognise
question
where we
to
need
end
to be.
with. Yep, thank you very much. We'll start with Charles, and the report does have that recommendation.
Yeah, I'm probably the least able to answer this question, Tony. I
Yeah,
guess
but
from a
you've read the
network
report, you'll have an
perspective,
opinion.
Yes. Look, I think it's important. A policy is critical for an industry like ours, and I'm talking here about the transmission part of the business, where we do want at least some certainty in order to plan for the future. So I think that's key. I think it's getting to a position where the industry knows the basis in which they're developing generation and therefore transmission from our perspective. I think that's a key requirement.
So what does certainty mean to you? That's the question I would follow up with, because is there no certainty under a direct action policy? Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's just settling on the rules, essentially. What is it over the long term that we all aspire to achieve, and so we can set out and start to plan for that.
So do you have a sense, as an industry person, that a direct action policy which requires government investment to cause reductions, in other words, taxpayers pay for the reductions, will not work in the long term?
I don't have a sense on that. I mean, my sense is really that we're looking at a future with reduced emissions, and that's going to drive different generation outcomes, and from a transmission perspective, we plan to work with that.
Okay, Phil, same question to you. Bipartisan support on these issues is going to be very hard to achieve. It is, however, written into the report. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think it is. It may be hard to achieve, but it is something that we should always be aiming for. I think the first point for us is that what we do have bipartisan support for is the 5% reduction by 2020 on 2000 levels. And we have a whole range of policy initiatives at the moment underway, including direct action, that are meant to take us to that target. So our first step priority is to understand exactly how direct action will
This,
work.
as Anna has pointed out, this is a report that goes out to 2050. So what needs to happen next?
Well, and I think the thing is, if we can get that clarity around what is the path to 2020, then we need to understand and what comes after that. And so where do you set your horizons? And we should have a continuity At the moment we don't have that, but we don't really have yet clarity on even the next 7 years, and so it's one step at a time from our perspective.
Yeah, but do you have advice for the government? I mean, it may not be advice you care to share in public, but do you have advice for the government as to what the... I mean, if you have a policy, you plan ahead. I mean, you need to make big investment decisions. So what should happen?
Well, I think the reason why we ask, all of us around here ask for a degree of bipartisan agreement and certainty is because of the long time frames in this industry. We're talking multiple years to even plan for projects, let alone build them, and then we're talking decades of lifetime. Not just what's in the system at the moment, but what might come. So we do think long term, and we do talk to government, and we talk to both sides of politics about how do we get that balance between the reliability in the sector, the cost, and what you want to achieve. The trick with that is being very clear on what we want to achieve.
Yeah.
And there are lots of ways you can get there and have that balance, but until we have the clarity of what we're trying to do, then...
But is there a view in your sector that you need a market-based solution as opposed to a government-based solution?
Well, we've always said we prefer a market-based solution, and I think that's where we're heading. One of the interesting things with this is, someone mentioned before, is consumers can drive policy. Now, we've been offering in the marketplace for the last 20 years green power products, and people can take up 100% green power from wind or solar sources, and we are then obliged to go and source that from renewable generation supply. Now, here we are 20 years later, we've promoted that a lot over that 20-year period. We have 500,000 households taking it, but the percentage that take 100% green that are prepared to pay the extra cost is less than 1%. So when you get to the hard-edged decision in the community, I want renewables, but am I prepared to pay for it? You don't get the take-up. So that the trick is the community willingness to do that with the political, how do we intervene and at what cost? They're not easy things to do, and we do have advice and we do talk to both sides of politics about how we might get there, but I think the community needs to come along and demonstrate that support for these solutions, market solutions, and I think that will then help government think about how do we go.
Before I come to Anna, I'll hear from John on this. So, market-based solution, you all agree?
I think what we'd support is the position in the paper, which is it's important to have bipartisan certainty around the emissions policy framework. Can I just give you one example that makes it very difficult to operate the modern electricity network, and that relates to solar PV. So at the moment, what we have is about 1 million households with solar PV on their roofs at the moment. And when we look forward in the projections, and the long-term projections of the Australian Energy Market Operator, there is 2,500 megawatts of uncertainty between the low scenario and the high scenario under current policy settings. So it's really important that government policy frameworks don't add to that level of uncertainty about what's happening already in terms of the market dynamics, because we've got a new program under direct action called Million Solar Roofs, which will provide a further $500 rebate to install solar PV and solar hot water systems. This is further spin on the ball, if you like, into an environment that's already quite dynamic. And that just creates a little bit more uncertainty for network businesses that are trying to manage uncertain demand profiles.
Anna.
I was going to pick up on the solar roofs to counter Phil's point that the community hasn't shown an interest in this. 1 million homes have taken up solar in very recent years. I think the community is changing, and it was true, the question previously was historically the consumer hasn't been very engaged, but I think that is really rapidly changing now, and the businesses that survive in the future will be the businesses that feed that hunger for information about what can the citizen do, what can the consumer do. We're seeing it at local community level. Every consumer is also a member of their local region, and particularly outside the major cities, the regions are really hungry for low carbon solutions that are industry-wide or even region-wide, and we're seeing some market responses to that. I think that is also a segue to the media conversation and the challenge about simple communications. I think you're right to point out the dichotomy between short-term and long-term priorities always being in conflict, particularly in politics. But that doesn't mean that there has to be a dichotomy between simple and complex communications. And I think we can have a conversation about the long term if we remember to keep it simple. And the simple terms, as we've started to understand, is that the status quo is not an option to continue. And that you've heard that today. So when we're thinking about even shortish term decisions like a 2020 renewable energy target, it's not an option to make a decision that helps soften the blow on the existing generation mix, because the simple starting point is that generation mix must change, and it must change faster than it is now if we're to respond to the climate change challenges. So I think if we're more simple in the starting point facts about change being necessary, then I think we can help push the policy frameworks to move as fast as the market has said is needed.
Okay, we're nearly out of time, but I'll give just brief answers from our last three panellists, starting with Matt.
I really don't have anything significant to add. You know, GE's position is we work with both sides of government, and we're always giving the same message that you know, we look for stability. We certainly like bipartisan policies because we've seen that they generally provide stability.
Sandra.
Yeah, I think I want to drive home the optimism about the desire of people to contribute. I was really struck by a conversation about people on low incomes and the link with obesity and the idea that people just don't know how to buy good food, when the truth is that good food at the moment in the market environment is expensive. It's more expensive than the really cheap, bad food for you. And equally, this applies in this area. And so it's incumbent upon us to get behind people's efforts and desires and to not allow it to open up as a field for exploitation, because I think that is real. I have the door-to-door salesperson in my mind saying, have we got a deal for you? That's not good for anybody. I think we've got to learn the lessons that we've had recently. Insulation is important. It's got huge benefits for us. Let us come back together in a sensible way to say, how can we deliver that better for the long term, so that where there is a market response needed, people can build their businesses safely around it, and we have the consumer protections that we need in place, and we'd love to work on that.
And finally, Paul, so maybe you could just set out briefly for us what you actually meant when you called for bipartisanship.
Yeah. I'm glad we got back to it. I think the key takeaway here is that most of the things we build in this sector last for 20 to 60 years. And that's, 20 to 60 years, that's 7 to 20 election cycles. So it's very difficult to make a decision, take your decision to the board. We need to spend so many millions or billions of dollars, and it's got to get through 7 to 20 election cycles. It's very difficult. And so we're trying to do our job here as an industry to create consensus, and now it's up to the government and the community and the industry to work together now to create a broader consensus.
Okay, well that is the beginning of a national conversation on this subject, we believe. We thank you very much for joining us. We thank you for your questions, and those watching online, we thank you as well, although I didn't in fact get any questions from you, that may be technical. We thank you, our panellists. I'd like you to give them a round of applause because they were terrific. Thank you very much, and that's where we'll leave you this morning. Thank you.